Hey, it's Soul, and this is another video. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that I have been kind of mulling over and kind of thinking out loud a little bit, but I haven't really just sat down and kind of thought through. And some of it's gone through my head. I want to share some of that today. I wanted to talk about Zandalari Paladins and how, at least so far, we do not expect to see them in the Battle for Azeroth expansion, which is, well, I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. So by the time I get to the end of this and I have like no script, I have nothing, I have no outline at all. I'm not entirely sure what sort of conclusion I'll come up with, but I have a feeling that you're not going to like it. But, well, let's see what we got. Now, not too long ago, there was, I can't remember off the top of my head whether this was data mined information or this was like official word from Blizzard. I think it was the former, that we kind of got an indication of what sorts of class race combinations were coming through for all the new allied races, specifically for Zandalari Trolls and for Dark Iron Dwarves. And at this point, the information suggests to us very, very strongly that we are not going to get Zandalari Paladins, and, well, people are pissed. And I have even expressed my disinterest in allied races as a whole, because I was like, well, if I can't have Zandalari Paladins, then why am I even going to bother? And this is me being, pretty close-minded about trying out new classes and stuff. I know that's entirely on me. Fact of the matter is, though, that since we're not going to get a new race class combination for Paladins, even though it's kind of expected to come, how are we supposed to feel about this? Maybe that's a silly way to ask it. You can feel however the hell you want, but it kind of makes me realize that creating a class race combination specifically for Paladins and some other classes like Shaman and Druid, those come to mind, they're pretty restricted when it comes to the lore. It was pointed out to me a number of times that yes, Zandalari Paladins of sorts do exist in the form of prelates, and we've seen these, I believe, during Mist of Pandaria, during the Throne of Thunder, where we would see certain kinds of trolls that use, in fact, light-based spell things, basically paladin things. And that makes for a pretty understandable and solid foundation as to why there should be troll wielding paladins. And in my opinion, that should be enough. That should be enough to warrant that. So we have to try to get in Blizzard's head and see if we can come to some sort of understanding as to why they are not going to be paladins, without immediately coming to the conclusion that that Blizzard sucks and they're big doo-doo and they should burn, whatever. This is kind of me giving Blizzard the benefit of the doubt. And when I think about this a little bit, I can kind of get where they're coming from. Back in the early days of Warcraft, when you became a paladin, it was very, knight in shiny armor sort of thing, wielder of the light, giant hammers, that sort of thing. It was a very, it was a club. It was an exclusive club. Only a couple folks got to be part of the Knights of the Silver Hand, and so on and so forth. Over time, of course, we've seen that order grow, and we've seen offshoots, like, for example, that Scarlet Crusade, that comes to mind. So that already gives us the idea that, yes, in order to become a paladin, you don't have to be a Knight of the Silver Hand, and I'm going to use that club, the Knights of the Silver Hand, as kind of the example for the other instances of paladins that we've seen over time. With the launch of the Burning Crusade expansion, we saw paladins move over to the Horde, whereas before they were with the Alliance, and now they're being introduced to the Blood Elves. But, and this is kind of a big but, they were given a new kind of identity, this whole Blood Knight idea. Effectively, the lore behind what it is to be a paladin started to kind of blur past the whole, yes, you must be a Knight of the Silver Hand or something like that, or you must be a human or a dwarf in order to wield the light, because now we're seeing Blood Elves come into the mix. And at the same time, we're seeing the spacefaring Draenei come into it too, so apparently the light exists in freaking space. And even back then, at least according to my crappy memory, Blood Elf Paladins, that there was kind of pushback there too. The whole idea of sucking up a Naru's power in order to wield the light, with blood magic kind of jumping into the mix, that didn't settle very well with, really diehard players that were really stuck on the idea of paladins being, entirely, super good, super holy, knight in shining armor sort of thing. So like I said, we started to see this blur on just how a paladin defined itself in the World of Warcraft. Now, we cut to a few expansions later into the Cataclysm expansion, and then all of a sudden, the Tauren are joining the mix. This time, Tauren become a new class race combination, and once again, the lore behind that has to be written in. In this case, they introduce a new order called the Sunwalkers. So once again, we kind of blur the definition of what a paladin is. You know, first we started with humans and dwarves, and then we introduced Draenei and then the Blood Elves, and now we have Tauren. The thing with the Blood Elves and the Tauren is that these are new kinds of orders. With the Draenei, Paladins have technically existed like the entire time, you know, with that race. Or at least I'm pretty confident that it did, with the whole Draenei escaping. They're teamed up with the Naru, so they probably learned how to be Paladins, whether they knew it or not, pretty early on. But the Blood Knights and the Sunwalkers in their earliest days, they drew upon the existing Paladin orders, as in like the Silver Hand and so on and so forth, in order to establish their own kind of identity as Paladins. And so in this case, what does that have to do with Zandalari Paladins? Why is it that they are not allowed to join these Paladin orders? Now, with at least trying to get an idea of just why is it that Zandalari Paladins might never come to be, we have to look at all these other races that have come beforehand, and they share a certain commonality. The way that they've functioned and operated has been very similar. Like, all Paladins use Crusader Strike and Judgment and Consecrate in some way, shape, or form. Other abilities like, oh goodness, Beacon of Light, Guardian of Ancient Kings, those are all iconic to the Paladin class. So when we look back at the existing Zandalari characters that are, you know, that are basically Paladins with these holy abilities, we also need to think of, well, do they, you know, do all the specs apply? Can Zandalari also be, you know, we've seen them as like Paladins of some sort, but do we see them as Holy Paladins, Retribution Paladins, Protection Paladins? Do we see a Zandalari Paladin, you know, using Guardian of the Ancient Kings? Does it sound good to have them raining hammers from the sky? And it's easy enough to say, yeah, sure, why not do it? Or to just modify, you know, modify these spells so that they fit the Zandalari troll theme. But at the same time, it could easily be no. Blizzard can come out and say, well, you know, there are trolls that utilize the light, but maybe they just call upon, you know, a light-based Loa. It can go both ways, where these Loa give them access to Paladin-like abilities, or to limit them in such to limit their abilities so much that they can't really be full-fledged Paladins. I mean, imagine if a Zandalari troll can be a Paladin, but they can only be like Retribution and Protection, and they can't be holy. It really comes down to the culture and how they build a sort of Paladin class around that. In fact, when I actually take a look at Wowpedia, I see the following abilities: that they have Judgment, they have kind of a Holy Light, and they also have this thing called Mark of the Loa, which inflicts holy damage every second for 15 seconds, and this effect stacks, whatever. So they obviously have abilities that draw upon the light, but does that automatically make them full-fledged Paladins? The narrative can be written in order to give them that sort of access, but the narrative doesn't have to be written either to absolutely prevent that access too. I don't know, I guess it's just that the idea of a Paladin is for the most part kind of fixed, and maybe in Blizzard's eyes it's a little bit too much of a stretch to give Zandalari Trolls that sort of access. And that's at the core of what makes it a little difficult to have these sorts of class race combinations like right out the gate. There are certain classes in WoW that are simply accessible. Every race can become a warrior. Other classes that you could say are easily accessible would include hunters, rogues, monks as well. Classes that I would say would have an intermediate level of restriction would be like casters, mages, warlocks, priests. Some of those classes have a culture around them. I mean, we don't have orc priests, for example, because orc shaman fit that whole, you know, they fit the class fantasy better. Zandalari may not be paladins, but they can be priests, and shaman apparently too. And speaking of shaman, I would say like shaman, druids, and paladins, those are like, you know, the advanced restrictive sorts of class combinations to hit. In order to get those class combinations to work, there needs to be, you know, a couple of dots to connect, which sounds kind of weird because the difference between a priest and a paladin isn't very far, right? They wield the light, they use it to heal, they use it to harm, they use it to inspire, and so on and so forth. You know, it kind of interconnects. We've seen, as recently as World of Warcraft Legion, we've seen a Night Elf priest convert into a paladin, which still kind of baffles me that it hasn't already been announced that Night Elf Paladins aren't going to become a thing. So I guess it stands that the culture and the lore of the Zandalari just hasn't quite been written enough to warrant paladins. Not yet, at least. It was said a number of times, and you know, it sucks because this is kind of the foundation of hope that we're standing on at this point, that the idea of a certain race class combination is something that's being revisited by Blizzard every expansion or so, where they decide, okay, is this race class combination, does it make sense right now? No. Is it going to make sense later? Maybe, as soon as we have the narrative written down for it. Personally, I think it's just kind of a matter of time before they allow this, but at the same time, Blizzard is pretty conservative about these certain classes that are harder for certain races to join up with. It actually wouldn't surprise me if at some point the Zandalari Troll, you know, if you're playing as a Zandalari Troll, you eventually run into like some sort of quest line where you team up with the Sunwalkers and the Blood Knights, and you effectively learn or unlock the Paladin class. It's just that I can see a scenario where Blizzard will just kind of hand wave this and explain it in a way that, no, Zandalari Trolls can't do this, they can't be Paladins because they don't know how to do all these Paladin-esque abilities, not yet. And from there we can judge and criticize and cry all we want. I'm really not going to stop you. It's whatever you folks want to think about it. So in my attempt to kind of summarize what I'm trying to say here, I would like to see Zandalari Paladins be a thing, but if Blizzard is able to speak as to why they can't, then, you know, and if it comes out well, then okay, well, I'll just deal with it, swallow it, and just wait till later. And because the story of the Zandalari hasn't quite been written yet, I'm willing to accept these sorts of class race restrictions for now. The time's gonna come where that sort of restriction no longer makes sense, but at least at the moment, the fact that we only see a couple of abilities that Zandalari Trolls can do in some instance, it's not enough for me to say, no, this is why it should definitely happen now because these reasons. Again, once we get through that Zandalari story and you know, we get them a chance to kind of simmer and acclimate into the Horde, then we can revisit this question, whether or not they can be Paladins. Or for all I know, they might just announce this right before the start of the expansion, and this entire rant of mine, this ramble fest of mine, is all for naught. Anyway, thanks for listening, and if you happen to watch this entire video, you guys were suckers because I pretty much had no visuals to show you at all. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your gripes and your criticisms in a comment below. We'll talk about it, we'll help each other feel better, or we'll rage together, whatever you like. Thanks again for stopping by. Like and sub to support the channel so I can give you more of this and all things World of Warcraft. I'll see you guys in the next video, and until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.